So there's a rumour circulating, and a number of people have messaged me about this, that Chris Eubank Jr. is probably going to sign with Eddie Hearn. Now, let me start by giving a few comments as to why this is potentially feasible. Comment number one. Chris Eubank Jr. has successfully done a good enough job of already burning bridges with Mick Hennessy and potentially Frank Warren due to the recent Billy Joe Saunders Chris Eubank Jr. rematch debacle. So potentially Eubank has succeeded in pissing off the two major other promoters outside of Eddie Hearn, and clearly he's a big enough name to still garner interest. So that makes me think, for a start, that is possible. It seemed clear from an IFL TV interview I watched that Eddie Hearn had a copy of the contract that Chris Eubank Jr. was issued with when he fought Billy Joe Saunders, which suggests that there is at least dialogue going on and that the two parties have some respect or desire to be in partnership to some extent. Eddie Hearn said that the purse was very, very low for that fight. And again, there's a suggestion there, obviously, that under Matchroom, under Sky, Eubank would earn more money than he's done under Frank Warren. So there's all these, possible reasons that Eubank Jr. could join Eddie Hearn. Obviously, the idea of being with Frank Warren, I guess, is to get the rematch with Billy Joe Saunders, and then to fight Andy Lee potentially if you win that fight, and have two big British middleweight, fights. And I guess if that's slipping away, if the Billy Joe fight isn't going to happen, if as a result the Andy Lee fight isn't going to happen, then maybe the point of being with Frank Warren is somewhat defeated, and you may as well take the sort of bigger route of working with Matchroom, being on Sky, and potentially of earning more money. So I could, logically see it happening. Obviously, Eubank Jr. is a draw. He's a big name, and I'm sure Matchroom would be interested in working with him. The difficulty I have, I guess, is twofold. The first difficulty is, if I'm Eddie Hearn, I mean, let's be honest, Eddie Hearn's pretty much ruling the roost at present. I know he's had a bad few months. I know he's had a lot of injuries, fights cancelled, that sort of stuff. And I know he's, in many ways, failed to replicate what he achieved last year with Froch Grove. So maybe the momentum isn't with Eddie Hearn. But let's be honest, he's sitting pretty, isn't he? He's got the long-term deal with Sky. He's got Anthony Joshua, who most people seem to believe is the best fighter to have ever lived. Note the sarcasm in my voice. You've got, the likes of Luke Campbell, Callum Smith coming through. You've got Carl Froch, Kell Brook, James DeGale, Scott Quigg. The list goes on. Eddie Hearn is sitting pretty. Does he want to risk that with the management disaster that is Chris Eubank Jr.? A guy who has the potential to humiliate and undermine a promoter. Does he want to start dealing with fighters who don't turn up to press conferences? Because put simply, Eddie Hearn doesn't have to. Frank Warren, kind of in the position he's in at present, maybe needs Eubank Jr. more than Eddie Hearn does. Eddie Hearn's got his own stars. So the question is Eddie Hearn prepared to go through the rigmarole of working with the Eubanks and the sort of difficulties and awkwardness that they bring to the table? My guess is he is, because as we know, and as he says himself, Eddie loves the pound note, and he'll use it as a way of trying to humiliate Frank Warren about what a good job he's done compared to Warren, and try and highlight how well Eubank Jr. is doing financially since he was with Frank Warren. But secondarily, and perhaps a bigger issue than that, is what fights does Eddie Hearn create for Chris Eubank Jr.? Because in my eyes, Eubank Jr. is still several fights away from world-level opponents. And by world-level opponents, I mean Quillen, Golovkin, Cotto. He's several fights away from that level. And by several, I mean more than one or two. Now, the difficulty is, if we drop down a level, if we talk sort of domestic, European level, the interesting fights just happen to be with Frank Warren. I mean, you've got I mean, don't get me wrong, Eddie Hearn has got a few options, but Frank Warren had Billy Joe and Andy Lee. Those are two blockbuster fights. Those are two fights that sell out football stadiums. Whereas, who does Eddie Hearn bring to the table? Spike O'Sullivan, maybe? I mean, I know Spike's not his fighter, but he's worked with Spike before. Does Eddie Hearn, throw in John Ryder? Does he try to organise a Nick Blackwell fight? Does he look at Martin Murray, who I understand he's recently signed to fight at 168? Does he look at making that at 160 or a catchweight? Does he feed Matthew Macklin, the corpse of Matthew Macklin, to Chris Eubank Jr? My point is, there are a few options for Eddie in terms of opponents for Eubank Jr. But there's nobody in the Hearn stable, to my knowledge, who sets the pulse racing as much as Andy Lee or Billy Joe Saunders. The fight just doesn't exist at this point within Eddie Hearn's team of fighters. So maybe you have him fight John Ryder, Nick Blackwell, as like a sort of welcome to the stable fight. And yeah, that's an interesting fight. It's going to garner attention. But after that, you're left in an awkward position where, he maybe sparks out Matthew Macklin, but then, Hearn will be looking at this as a long-term investment. He won't want him knocked out by Triple G just yet. So the question is, what do you do then? And then there's an involvement of bringing in expensive overseas fighters who the public maybe haven't heard of to increase his rankings. Perhaps that's a less attractive route for Hearn than Warren, having these sort of big domestic names. And, that would also help catapult Eubank. Because if Eubank beat Billy Joe, then beat Andy Lee, he'd be in pole position to get like a fight with Miguel Cotto, for example. So it's interesting. I could see it happening. I think Eubank and Warren are obviously on not the best terms, so logically it makes sense, and Eubank's going to need to fight. He's going to want to stay active, he's going to want to push his career in the right direction, so maybe he views Matchroom as the answer. I think Eddie Hearn would want to get another one over Frank Warren, and clearly has a decent relationship there. The two questions though are, does Eddie Hearn have immediate access to the type of opponents Frank Warren has, and does Eddie Hearn have the patience to put up with the Eubank antics? Let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching.